So welcome everyone to our open house this evening, Wednesday, November 10th, for communities in Adams County. To provide as smooth experience as possible for all participants, please keep your audio on mute. We will be enabling the live transcript feature on Zoom during this meeting, so you may see that live transcript already popping up. If you don't have it enabled yet, you can view it by choosing the button on the menu bar that says live transcript and a little CC next to it. Like I said before, we will be recording this meeting and it will be posted publicly to the Mile High Flood District website. So to give you a lay of the land, what we're going to be doing tonight is presenting some slides for about 20 to 30 minutes. And then we'll have some time for questions and we'll be looking at some maps. We're here for you tonight. So if you do have any questions during the presentation, please use that chat box on the menu bar during the presentation and you can type your question in there. We will be monitoring the comments and questions throughout the session, but we will have a dedicated question and answer session before we look at the map. So bear with us. If something comes to mind, go ahead and put it in the chat. We'll see it and we'll get to it during the question and answer session after we run through some slides. Do keep in mind that anything you put in the chat box is visible to all participants. During the question and answer session, we welcome you to also come off mute and on camera if you want to ask your question live, or we can revisit some slides during that session. So I'm going to admit, it looks like we have a newcomer coming in right now. So today we are gathering because it's important to understand flood risk, but let's go ahead and meet who is in the room. And real quick, before we do this, I want to make sure that everyone had a chance to fill out that poll. So if you haven't filled out that poll yet, go ahead and make your selections on the first and second question there, hit submit, and we will be able to end the poll and view the results. And we want to hear more about you and learn more about you. So please do that. And I'll be closing the poll very shortly in 3, 2, 1. And let's go ahead and look at those results real quick. So how'd you hear about this meeting? Looks like everyone heard about it from the letter. So folks are reading their mail, paying attention to their mail. Appreciate that. And then the question of what group best describes you. We've got some property owners here, so that's great. Let's meet the folks in the room. I'll go ahead and hand it over to Stacy from Mile High Flood District to kick us off with the introductions. Stacy, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Yep, my name is Stacy Thompson and I'm with the Mile High Flood District. I'm the floodplain manager and managing the physical map revision project.
Good evening. I'm Brooke Seymour, also with the Mile High Flood District. I'm an engineering services manager.
And good evening, Greg Labrie, Adams County Senior Development Engineer, as well as the Adams County Floodplain Manager.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm Pam Aker. I'm the Stormwater Coordinator and Floodplain Administrator for the City of North Glen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Kaiser. I'm Infrastructure Engineering Manager for the City of Thornton and also the city's Floodplain Manager.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Gaines. I'm with FEMA Region 8, and I am the mapping lead for the state of Colorado.
Hi, this is Erin May. I'm the National Flood Insurance Program Flood Insurance Liaison Specialist, whatever you want to call me. And I'll be going over the insurance implications of the map changes tonight.
I don't think we have Doug on tonight, but he was representing CWCB, but we'll go ahead and move on to John.
Good morning or good afternoon, evening, everyone. My name is John Pink. I am with Compass. This is FEMA's contractor, and we are the ones who actually take Mile High Flood District data and turn it into FEMA flood maps. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, John. And I'm Sam Bug. I'm with Resilience Action Partners. We are a contractor of FEMA that help with the CERC program, or the Community Engagement and Risk Communications program. So we will go ahead and dive right in and start to talk about flood risk and why it's so important. So over to you, Stacy.
Thanks, Sam. So yeah, why is flood risk so important? Well, no matter where you live or work, some risk of flooding exists, and flood risk can vary within the same neighborhood and even property to property. It's important to know your property's flood risk and that flood risk changes over time. You can also take action to mitigate your risk. And it's important to know that most homeowners insurance and renters insurance do not cover flood damage. And we have experienced floods here in Colorado and in the metro area. The photo in the upper right corner is from Westerly Creek during the 2013 floods. And that's near Havana and Alameda in Aurora. And again, why are we here? Well, the new flood maps for Grange Hall Creek and the tributaries become effective on December 2nd. This open house is intended to answer common questions and show you where to find additional information. We will show you how to view the flood maps to better understand your individual risk, what you can do to lower your risk and protect your investments, as well as learn about local permit requirements for development or substantial improvements in the floodplain. So your community participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, essentially through an agreement with FEMA. And through the agreement, your community has agreed to enforce floodplain management regulations that meet or exceed the minimum National Flood Insurance Program requirements. And in exchange, federally backed flood insurance is made available to everyone in the community. And you do not have to live in the high risk zone to be able to purchase flood insurance. And through participation in the program, your community is also eligible for federal disaster assistance grants and loans. The ultimate goal of the program is to reduce disaster suffering. And as I mentioned, flood risk does change over time, and FEMA requires communities to update and maintain flood risk information. And the Mile High Flood District partners with local communities to identify and communicate the flood risk. And we do this through the development of flood hazard area delineation studies, which we refer to by the acronym FAD, which is spelled FHAD. And these updated FAD studies capture changes that have impacted existing floodplains using best available data and technology to best represent actual flood risk. And the physical map revision is the FEMA process to incorporate the FAD study into the FEMA flood map products. And updated flood maps provide a more accurate picture of your property's flood risk and your community's flood risk. And your community uses the flood maps to ensure land development activities comply with the minimum local, state, and federal floodplain management regulations. And insurance agents and lenders use the flood maps to determine insurance requirements. This slide reflects the overall physical map revision project timeline. It was initiated back in 2018. The asterisks do denote steps in the process that included community review and comment. And I'd like to highlight some of our outreach efforts that we've conducted throughout the study. Individual notification letters were mailed to affected property owners last summer when the maps were still preliminary and prior to the 90-day appeal period. And a virtual open house similar to this was also held. And then we did send individual notification letters again last month ahead of the upcoming effective date. And it's just important to understand flood risk may be changing for some and insurance requirements. So what do we mean when we talk about flood risk when it comes to the mapping? Again, flood risk impacts everyone, and it's a degree of risk. For those of you with high risk, the high risk flood zone is also known as the special flood hazard area or the 100-year floodplain, and it consists of both the flood fringe and the floodway. And the flood fringe is the area shown in solid blue, and the floodway is the cross-hatched area. And a floodway is the highest hazard area of the floodplain with the highest flood depths and velocities. What we refer to as the moderate risk area is the area shown in yellow or tan. And low risk is anywhere outside of those two areas. And it's really important to understand that low risk does not mean no risk. And we also want to make you aware that when you view the mapping on different websites, there may be different colors, between the county or the city, or even the Mile High Flood District's mapping. This image is from FEMA's National Flood Insurance layer, and the colors reflect FEMA's requirements for their flood insurance rate maps. And I think with that, we're going to launch poll number 2. And so we would like to know if you know which flood zone you are in, either the high risk, moderate risk, low risk, or if you don't know.
So go ahead and make your choice. It's okay if you don't know which flood risk zone you are in, and it is important, Stacy said, low risk does not mean no risk. Everyone is at some level of risk, and anywhere it rains, it can flood. So we've got a few folks that have already submitted their answers. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll real quick. 3, 2, 1. And let's see those results. What do you think, Stacy?
Well, 2 people know and 2 people don't know. So we'd be happy to help those of you that are unsure during the question and answer better understand your risk, or you can follow up with your local floodplain administrator or me as well to understand the mapping and what it means in relation to your property. With that, I think Erin is up.
Yes, good evening, everybody. So let's talk about why we identify this risk. Why do we do this? Well, it's because flood risk changes over time, and we need to update the maps to reflect the changing risk. In some cases, that might mean that your flood risk has gone down since the last map. It may mean that there's been a lot of development in your area and there's a lot less green space open and available. And so with less green space, that means there's less availability for the ground to soak up that water when we get those large flood events like we did in 2013. And I think it's really important. I would say at almost every map meeting I've been at, somebody says, oh, I'm not in a flood zone. Well, everybody's in a flood zone. It's whether you're in a high risk flood zone, which is any A zone here in Colorado, or that moderate risk, which was that tan area that Stacy pointed out on the map, or low risk, which doesn't have any shade or color over the map itself. And sadly, we are seeing increases in that low risk flood zone. Here in Colorado in 2013, that our claims in that flood event were like 35 to 40% for people who are in low to moderate risk flood zones. And so, that risk is going up even, where we haven't mapped people into that high risk flood zone. And so we want you guys to be considering the risk if you're near an A zone and considering flood insurance, because just because there's a line on the map that says you're out, it does not mean that the water isn't going to move towards your house in a large flood event. And the other thing that's kind of surprising for people is that flooding is the number one natural disaster worldwide for loss of life and property. And if you're in a high risk flood zone, what that means is you have a 1 in 4 chance over a 30-year mortgage of experiencing a flood during the time that you own that home. It's kind of shocking. But flooding is actually higher risk than fire here in Colorado. And I know that's hard to believe, but the statistics prove it out every time. It's shocking. Let's go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit more in depth. So how does this work? Well, basically, if you have a federally backed loan, which is, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, any of those most people have a federally backed loan. I'm just going to say that very few people have a privately backed loan. The lender is going to require coverage if you are in any of those blue areas on the map or the striped areas on the map. That's an A zone. And so they're going to say, hey, you're now in a high risk flood zone. We're going to require flood insurance. And so the lender adjudicates that. They look at the maps and make that determination. There are things you can do, which Stacy will talk about a little bit later on. If you don't agree with the lender's determination, and if anybody has a question about that with their lender, I'm always happy to help with that. And then also there's a 30-day waiting period on our policies. So it's always better to buy well in advance of the flood season if you think the risk is high for a particular year. I listed here 3 exceptions, but we're just going to talk about one tonight since it applies to your scenario. And that is there's only a 1-day waiting period following a map revision for a year after that map revision. And so we ask that your map goes into effect December 2nd. So that means you have until December 2nd to have an effective policy. And we really ask people to write that policy more like 30 to 45 days before that December 2nd deadline. So the policy has time to be underwritten and become effective. So, and then there's been a big change within the National Flood Insurance Program. We were really working off of pretty old data and the way we underwrote policies. And so starting October 1, we moved to a new rating system, and we've now got a database and an application that looks at a lot of different factors that we didn't look at before. And it more closely follows what private industry does for your homeowner's policy. So it looks at a number of different things, and we're going to go into a little more depth. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk here just about what our coverage amounts are. So the maximum amount of coverage available through the NFIP is $250,000 for a residential policy, and then $100,000 in contents. And then for non-residential, it's $500,000, or other residential, it's $500,000 for both. And then renters can get a contents policy for $100,000. And then we have maximum deductibles of $10,000 or $50,000 for non-residential or other residential. We used to have much smaller maximum deductibles. So we increased those so people could look at ways to lower their costs if they wanted to self-insure for that first $10,000. I would say most people have a deductible of between our minimum deductible of $1,250 to maybe a $2,000 deductible. The majority of people carry that lower deductible. And with that, I think we can go to the next slide and start digging in on what these changes look like. So a lot of people have voiced their concerns about the changes. Nobody ever likes change with and it's the same is true in the NFIP. So let's look at the Colorado impact. It's really not going to have a huge impact here in Colorado. As you can see, the bulk of our policies are going to see either a decrease in premium, so good news for a lot of people, and then 48% of our policies are going to see a $0 to $120 premium increase for their premium once they reach that full risk rate, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And then there's about 9% across the state who are going to see a more significant premium increase. But that, 9% out of our total policies is actually pretty small. So I think we're not looking at a huge impact here in Colorado. And for anybody who wants to take a look at how those premiums are going to affect you and your zip code, you can go click on this link down below, or you can just type in FEMA Equity in Action, and it'll bring up the main landing page for Risk Rating 2.0. And at the very bottom, it'll have the state profiles, and you can download the spreadsheet and look up your zip code and see what those percentages are for your specific zip code. So you can get an idea if you have an existing policy in particular, you might be interested. So let's go on to the next slide. And this takes a second to load, but these are the new rating factors. The biggest changes are under the geographic variables. So in the past, we rated you based on whether you were in a high-risk flood zone. We used our flood map. If you were in an A zone, you were required to carry flood insurance, and that determined your rate. If you were in a low-risk flood zone or a moderate risk flood zone, you qualified for what's called a preferred risk rate. And in some instances, people might have had a grandfathered policy, which basically meant, let's say, on the old map, you were in one of those low to moderate risk flood zones and you moved into an A zone, a high risk flood zone for the first time, you could grandfather that old flood zone and lock in that old flood zone rate, not as good as the preferred risk rate, but still lock in that rate if you wanted to. And I have seen a few grandfathered policies here in Colorado, so I know we have some, not as many as you'd think, but we do have some. And so now all policies are going to be based on the distance from the flooding source. So what we found over time is those preferred risk policies were really representing a pretty big chunk of our claims, and we could no longer keep those premiums inordinately low to try and draw people into carrying flood insurance. We needed to really represent the risk. And so the grandfathered policy and the preferred risk policy in some ways were considered subsidies by FEMA. And so now those are going away and everyone's going to be based on the distance from a water source. So it'll be a lot more fair. So, in the past, you'd have these two neighbors, giving me a call and saying, hey, I'm in a high risk flood zone and my neighbor isn't. And we're right next door to each other. Why is that? So now it's all going to be based on that distance from a water source. So their rates are going to be more similar than they were in the past. And then we're also going to base, in the past, we based things on the base flood elevation on the flood maps, which was how high we estimated the risk, how high the floodwaters would go to in a large flood event. And now we're going to base rates off of the local relative elevation, which is where the water sits normally in your water source. So, and then we're going to also look at the elevation of your structure and our database, this application that we've worked very diligently to put together, and all the insurance companies have access to the same database and they're using the same tool now, which is great. And that elevation for your home is going to be already input into the system, which is kind of cool. So we're grabbing that from existing tools that are available out there, and most private flood insurance companies have been using this data for quite some time. So we're kind of catching up to what private flood insurance has been doing. And we've been working with that private industry to kind of more similarly match how they do business. And then the final 4 bullets there on the left are all related to how we rate your flooding source and your area. So territory basically means, is it a rural area or is it a highly dense area? Obviously, the higher the density, closer to a water source, the higher the risk. And I apologize for my dog in the background. Get out of the way, baby. Down. Come on, down.
Hey, Erin.
Yes.
This is Chris Gaines. There's a couple questions in the chat. I don't know if.
Okay, well, I'll get through this and then I'll answer them after I get done.
Sounds good.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, I did see them. So then the last couple there are basically how we rate the water source. It's the class of river, the drainage area, or the river class itself. There's a stream class and a river class that are going to be going into that variable for your insurance. And then probably the biggest thing in that second section under building variables that's changing is that we are now going to be basing rates on replacement cost value of the structure itself. And what's really cool about that is that it's going to eliminate some inequity that we had in how policies were rated in the past, in that we didn't look at replacement cost value. And so a lower cost home to rebuild was paying the same rate as somebody whose home had a higher replacement cost value. So it was really unfair that lower cost structure was sort of subsidizing the higher cost structures, which it wasn't great. So we've now eliminated that by looking at replacement cost value. And again, the tool grabs that information of the replacement cost value is already input into the system, and it geolocates your property and grabs that information. And then I'm trying to look through here. So the last bullet in that section is also changing a little bit. We're still offering mitigation discounts. The really cool part is we're offering mitigation discounts now for everybody. Previously, the only people who could take advantage of mitigation discounts were for those people who were in high-risk flood zones. So now people can, who are in low to moderate risk flood zones, can make these changes to their property to lower their premium if they'd like, and help themselves risk-wise, help themselves be better at recovery by making some of these changes. The one thing that is changing with this mitigation discounts, though, is that all of the mitigation items now need to be done. You can't just do one mitigation thing and see a lowering in rate. So they all need to be done at once. So that is a change. And then the other variables are all staying the same. We are changing some of the way the discounts work. So in the past, we had this newly mapped process where now for anybody with an existing policy, there's going to be a glide path to that full risk rate. And on your renewal notices this year for existing policyholders, you will see what that final full risk rate will be. And then you'll see what your discounts are for that glide path, and you'll see what premium you're supposed to pay this year. And then also we do have participating communities in our program called CRS. It stands for Community Rating System. And these communities go above and beyond our other communities. And because of the work they do in floodplain management and the oversight that our administrative side looks at the work that they do, they get a discount. And so the more effort they make, the better discount you guys get as a policyholder. So, and that's been around, CRS has been around for a while. Let's go to the next slide and we can talk a little bit more about how this glide path is going to work. So as I mentioned, that grandfathered policies, existing policies, and preferred risk policies are going to be going away. And most NFIP policies are going to be subject to this 18% annual cap increase every year until they get to that full risk rate. And your renewal notice this year, like I said, is going to show what your final rate will be. And then I'll show you what your glide path rate is and what you pay at the bottom of your renewal notice. So it should be fairly straightforward, but as people get renewal notices, if you have questions, I'm happy to go over it with you. And I'm not going to go into great depth on some of these other bullets here because it digs into the weeds a little bit. But the main thing to know is we are going to have a glide path for existing policies. Anybody buying a policy for the first time after October 1 goes straight to our full risk rate. So they don't go on this glide path. That's the big thing to know. So if you have an existing policy already, it benefits you because you've got that glide path to that full risk rate. And the other thing I like to mention for anybody who's maybe not happy with the outcome after the map change and how much their premium is going up, you can always consider private flood insurance. The thing to know is that every private policy is different. So don't assume they have the same policy definitions, the same coverages. You really need to do your due diligence and ask what the coverages are. And the main question is that I think is the easiest thing to say is how closely does this mirror the NFIP policy, the federal policy? And then if the agent doesn't know that, they can track that information down for you. There are some things I like about private flood policies, but I have seen private flood policies that do not have as good a definition of a flood. So they may have a more narrow definition of a flood. But we've got some good carriers here in Colorado who actually offer loss of use. So if you were to flood, you could live someplace else while you're going through your recovery process. Our policy does not offer that. And some of these private policies also cover contents in a basement, which our policy does not, except for a washer and dryer and a freezer and the items in the freezer for contents. Now your building elements like your mechanicals and things like that are covered under the building element of the policy. Let's go to the next slide. And I think I've covered everything. This again just sort of gives you the various scenarios of being mapped into that high risk flood zone and you know, what that will look like in terms of timing. But I think the main thing to keep in mind is anybody who's renewing between now and March 31st, you can call if you have an existing policy and see if the new rating methodology helps you. There is a possibility that your rates, as we saw on that initial slide, 43% of our policies in Colorado, the rates are going to go down. So you could potentially get a refund if you call in and talk to your agent and have them just double check what that new rating scenario is going to look like for you. If your policy renews after March 31st, you have to wait until 90 days before your policy renews, which I just learned this week. I tell you, I keep learning new little ins and outs of how they're implementing this program, the changes to the program. So, and for those of you who may be coming out of that high-risk flood zone, on this map, there's, you know, you're no longer going to have a lender requirement. So, you know, you can talk to your lender about dropping policy and submitting any documentation from the lender to your agent to cancel your policy. But we really encourage people to stay in the program, especially if you're in a low risk flood zone and you're very close to that high risk flood zone. So if you're, you know, miles away, maybe your risk isn't as high, but if you're right next door to a high risk flood zone, we really encourage you to carry flood insurance. And with that, I think I'm gonna turn it back over to, is it Stacy that's going after me? I can't remember.
Yep.
And then I'll answer the questions in the chat as best I can now.
We can visit those when we do the question and answer session, which is going to be very coming up very quickly after these few slides. But Aaron, I didn't know, did you cover excess coverage?
Oh, no, I didn't talk about that. So as you guys notice, we have a maximum amount of coverage available through the NFIP of 250,000. And that's not sufficient for a lot of homes in Colorado. So there is excess coverage available through private insurance. There's excess flood coverage available. So if anybody is looking at doing that, and I know we had a lot of people in Boulder County after the fires in 2012 carry excess coverage on top of their NFIP flood policy. So we do allow for an excess policy. We're the first dollar. So in other words, where your claim, the first $250,000 comes first through us, and then the excess covers whatever amount might exceed that. Hopefully it doesn't, but you never know. And it's something to consider. Thanks, Sam,
Awesome.
for bringing that up.
Thank you. And then we're going to cover just a couple more slides before we get into some questions, but I will hand it over to Stacy.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Aaron, for covering excess coverage. So FEMA does have a process for individual homeowners. If you think your property has been incorrectly mapped in the high-risk zone, you can submit a request to FEMA for a letter of map amendment, which we refer to as a LOMA, L-O-M-A, or a letter of map revision based on fill, which is a LOMR-F. And it's a review. It's a comparison review of the lowest adjacent grade, which is a surveyed elevation touching your home or building in comparison to the adjacent base flood elevation. And if the lowest adjacent grade is higher than the base flood elevation and FEMA agrees, FEMA would issue a determination that your building is elevated above the base flood elevation, and it would officially remove a mandatory purchase requirement. It would consider your building being out or above that base flood elevation. And the caveat is that it's still always at your lender's discretion to require insurance if they believe there is risk. And we do have a handout available that I think you should be able to click on the link on the bottom of the slide to walk you through the letter of map amendment process and the application and what's required. And we do also have it posted on the project website, the physical map revision project website for Adams County. Thanks, Sam. So your community also has responsibilities, as we discussed with participation in the National Flood Insurance Program, and your community has adopted floodplain management regulations. I do want to highlight that a floodplain development permit is required for all development in the high-risk flood zone, and development generally means any man-made change. And the floodplain regulations will vary by local government, so it'll be really important for you to reach out to your floodplain administrator or local development review or planning services department. So how can you reduce your risk? Well, firstly, we want you to know your risk. That's the first step, and you have opportunity to review the flood maps and ask questions. We want you to understand your options, and that includes talking to your insurance agent about flood insurance. Also talking to your floodplain administrator about building requirements and other ways to reduce your risk, which can include mitigating your risk, and that could be elevating your utilities or for some installing flood vents. We also encourage you to talk to your floodplain administrator about your community's participation in the community rating system, or you can encourage your community to participate in the program. The community rating system recognizes community floodplain management practices and efforts to reduce community risk of flooding. And then in exchange, flood insurance premium rates are discounted to reflect the reduced risk of flooding. We do want you to be prepared and to be safe and to consider the purchase of flood insurance. Those who are insured recover faster and more completely from a flood than those without flood insurance. We also want you to consider developing an emergency plan so your family will know how to respond to a disaster and develop an emergency supply kit as well. And with that, I think we're ready for any questions.
Yeah, and it looks like we already have some in the chat, and I know it looks like Aaron, you're replying to some of Chris's questions in the chat, but I think it would be good just to kind of summarize those questions and then your answer, Aaron, because that question that Chris has, where he says, so it looks like I'm very near a high risk and that low risk is at my property, but then also saying that it implies that everyone, as we are all in flood zones, as stated earlier, are required to buy flood insurance. So just to clear some of that up, and that is a very common question, Aaron, would you mind summarizing your answer
Yeah.
to that?
Not at all. Yeah. So the only people who are required to carry flood insurance are people with a federally backed loan. So private lenders are not required to follow the same standards that a federally backed lender is. The only people who are required to carry flood insurance through their lender is if you're in an A zone, any A zone here in Colorado. And the only kind of sticky part is that it's just the structure that they should be looking at. So a lot of times the lenders will look at the whole parcel and see, especially if it's a large rural parcel, they may see that part of that parcel is in a high risk flood zone, but the structure is out, and they may still try to require flood insurance, even though your building is not in that high risk flood zone, and it is the building only that the federal requirements look at. So sometimes you have to work with your lender, show them a map. Other times they won't just take them. Sometimes, working with your community official and having the community official pin your address for you and say the structure is out, we'll do it, and you can remove the requirement for flood insurance. But sometimes you do have to go through the formal letter of map amendment out as shown process, which is free through FEMA, but it does take time. So during that time, you may have to carry flood insurance until you get this resolved. Sometimes lenders do get a little overzealous and they say, hey, the parcel's they're in a high risk flood zone, they get flood insurance, and the structure is clearly out. So, and that's all the federal requirement is for the structure, not the entire parcel. We're only concerned about buildings.
Thanks so much, Aaron.
Mhm.
Looks like, I think you did have another question for Chris about pre-existing mitigation.
Yeah, I'm not sure what he meant by that.
Okay.
And I asked him to elaborate, but I haven't seen him answer.
No
And good
worries.
job, Thornton, on your CRS class 6. That's a pretty nice discount. Let's see. Things done during construction. You mean on the mitigation during construction of the original structure? So yeah, Chris, if there were things done during construction that would fall into those mitigation categories, they can be considered, but now we've got all the mitigation elements that need to be considered. So in the past, people could save money just by adding flood vents if they had an elevated structure. Those flood vents allowed the water to flow in and flow out. Well, now you've got to do the flood vents. You've got to elevate your mechanicals above the first floor height of the structure. And then also, what else am I missing, you guys? I'm missing something on mitigation discounts. Help me.
Did you mention elevating utilities?
Yeah, elevating. So that means elevating your air conditioner, your furnace, your water heater. Those kinds of things need to be out of the basement or the crawl space. So all of those need to be done, and then they need to be shown on an elevation certificate. Although, actually, I take that back. That used to be the case. You had to submit an elevation certificate to show those mitigation efforts. But now they will, it's simply a question they ask. However, I will say, if they find at claim time that these elements weren't mitigated properly, you're going to see less at claim time because they're going to take out what the difference in premium. So if they see that these mitigation elements weren't properly mitigated. So, and then if you want to, you can also get the one thing I didn't talk about, Sam, that I'm just realizing I forgot, is talking a little bit about elevation certificates. So this application that they now have to write new business and the renewal business through makes assumptions about your property, but you can also about the elevation and these mitigation elements and that kind of thing, and or the type of building it is. For example, we've got different types of foundation types, and somebody can come out to your home. Generally, it's done by a surveyor engineer, and they fill out this elevation certificate, put in all that information, and then we can also rate you off of that elevation certificate to see if that helps you. If some of you on the phone have already done one of those and submitted it to underwriting, they will take that into consideration and look at what the best rate is, either through using the application's assumptions or using your elevation certificate. So,
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron.
yeah. Mhm.
And we'll give another quick shout out for the community rating system communities like Adams County. Greg was saying that Adams County is a CRS class 8, and then City of Thornton is a class 6. So that helps everyone in the community as far as discounts and being safer. So
Yeah.
that's great.
I think our best story in FEMA Region 8 is Fort Collins. And as many of you know, we had a dramatic loss of life back in the 70s, over 300 people. And then in the 80s, we lost about 80 people in that area. And then in 2013, we only lost, and still tragic, but we only lost 7 people across the entire state because of our floodplain management efforts. And the savings and infrastructure cost, because we were building smarter with our new things that were being built across the state, it was a huge savings. So, and what's really impressive to me is that the city of Fort Collins during that 2013 event did not have a single claim, not one, within the city limits of Fort Collins. So that shows you what that floodplain management effort can have for a community. And Fort Collins recognized that early on and jumped on board, and they've been a real success story for our region. So, you know, I applaud all of the communities that are joining in the community rating system. We know it's a lot of work for you to do, but it does, you know, there are big benefits.
Absolutely. And then I'm going to go ahead and call out Crystal because she asked a great question. And don't worry, Crystal, we are going to answer your question on the next slide. And she asked, where can I view the maps and see where I am? So yes, we have some chatter back and forth in the chat, so don't worry, we are going to get to that right now. I don't see any other specific questions, so let's go ahead and I will transfer over to John, who's going to be able to take us through this viewer that is available to everyone on this link, and it will be available after this call. So John, I will hand it over to you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you show everyone this awesome viewer.
John, you're mute.
Can't hear you. Yeah. Don't worry, we're going to get through this.
How about now?
Yes,
You can hear me now.
I can.
Weird. Yesterday, it's the opposite issue. I had to change, whatever. I don't know when we get into that. Sorry about that. So I'm glad you can hear me now, because without my voice, this would be impossible to do. I'm going to share my screen. There were some questions about the viewer with updated mapping. I think it was from Christopher. You have a different, that's not the current map, web map. In the PowerPoint, there's a link to the current web map, and I'm going to review that right now. And then you'll have the PowerPoint, and you can navigate to it and look through your property. So I'm going to quickly show everyone some features. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, minimize this. So this is the splash page when you navigate to the web map. I'm going to kind of go through quickly some features in the web map. You scroll with your mouse, of course, these are some basic things. You can type in an address here. So if you want to look up your specific property, you can just navigate directly to that address through the address search bar. There's also a number of icons up here in the top right. One thing that I think is useful is this bookmark icon. If you want to look at, Adams County on a whole, you can zoom directly to Adams County. So how to use this web viewer? You have your layer list, your legend, which will show you what you're looking at, and we can go through. You can change what's in the base. I don't know that it's really useful in terms of you can get different base layers. I think this is the best one. Has a lot of roads and it shows the properties. But when you use this, you're going to want to use your layer list. And how you navigate this is, so if you're looking at an area, I'm not going to put any addresses in because it's frowned upon because it's personal information. But say you're navigating and you want to look at, one of these properties here, right? Just a random area I looked at. This final flood hazard mapping, that is going to be what the mapping will become. The effective flood hazard mapping, that's the existing. So this is what's going to be replaced with the new mapping, right? So if you want to look at the effective mapping, you can look through, you should click these drop downs. You can look at the effective mapping. This is the current mapping. You can see here 0.2% chances, the 500-year SFHA, the 1% annual chance, that's 100-year. That's what people were referring to as a zone A or AE, but that's your regulatory. If you're in this, kind of that color mapping, that is, mandatory purchase minimums. But if you want to look at what the mapping is going to look like, you're going to look at this final flood hazard mapping, and you can turn off the effective mapping because unless you want to compare. But if you want to look and see what's going to be happening in the next few months of how this mapping is going to change, you can look directly at this. And what we're looking at here is the 500-year is this yellow area, the 100-year, which is the SFHA. That's your regulatory flood zone. This is the blue, and then your floodway has different, regulatory criteria. Is this hatched, right? So you can see that you can zoom in pretty close, actually really good resolution, and you can look and say, oh yeah, if this was my structure, we are out of this, floodplain. If I was this structure, it's very close, but that's one of those instances that, I think it was discussed earlier that your lender has the option to say, oh, this is so close that, this can be required. It's very rare that that happens, but I'm trying to find a good example of maybe where, like this one, oh, that wasn't it. This home here. So because this 100-year catches the edge of this building, that entire building would be considered in the flood zone. It's either all in, or even part of it being in. It considers it in. So I think that's the most useful tools. There's a slicer here, a swiper, and so if you want to look, you click this swiper button up here on the right, and then you take this thing in the middle, and you can see what it used to be to what it's going to become. You can see how this is changing, right? So that's I don't know if that is something you want to look at, but just that's a little tool that's available to you. So I think that is it for me. Don't forget your address search. Easiest way is to type in your address. But so that is it for me. That was quick. I'll go back to the PowerPoint and I'll show you that we put some screenshots in there just to make sure that everyone, if you forget how to do some of these things, we provide some details of how to do it. So yeah, again, this is the splash page that we started with. Like I said, it provides some really good information to make decisions about insurance options available for your property. And it just shows you, this is the splash screen. So next slide. Again, this kind of reviews what each one of those navigation tools at the top right are and what they do. Next one. This just kind of highlights how to do your address search. It's pretty intuitive if you use Google Maps or anything, but you type in your address there. Just don't forget that. You can also use GPS coordinates if for some reason that's what you want to use or what you have. So next slide. This kind of shows you how you can update the base layer. So you can look at different base maps with the data overlaying on top of them. Again, I don't know, you have to look and see the other base layers that might be useful. The one you're going to want is the Bing Map Hybrid, because that shows each property. So that's the one you'll be using most likely. Next one. And then this is our pending effective data. Kind of shows how you turn those on and off, and what you can also turn on the panel boundaries as well, which I didn't show you, but if you just hit that drop down area, you'll see that. So yeah, this is effective December 2nd. This is what we've been talking about. And then this is your effective flood hazard mapping. This is what's currently, this is what will be going away. But I just wanted to keep those in there so you know exactly which one is differentiate between the two. I think that's it for me.
Great, thanks so much, John. It's always good to kind of see what's going on with the viewer and some of the features that folks can pop in there and see for themselves. Chris had another question about if it touches the covered patio, and Aaron, yep, looks like you answered it in the chat, and what John was also talking about. It's if the cover is not attached in any way to the structure, a LOMA application could be submitted to be removed, but good detail needs to be shown so it's clear the cover isn't connected. So Chris, it sounds like, yeah, you need to figure out with the cover and with the deck as well. So All right, this slide is all of our contact information. So we've had some really good questions and really appreciate everyone's participation this evening. You can figure out who you need to talk to based on your question. If it's a insurance question, Aaron, for example, would be the person to be able to help you with that. But this will be available on the slide deck in the PDF that will be distributed. And we are here to help with any questions or get you an answer or investigate for you. So with that, I wanted to do one last ask. If anyone has any additional questions that you want to come off mute or put into the chat, or ask any of the folks we have here this evening, I will give you a chance to do that now. Chris, it looks like you said you wanted to circle back to the question about private insurance and mortgage lenders. Let me see.
What
that
didn't
one.
I answer? I thought I put my answer in there, Sam. But maybe I missed his point. So I guess basically, if it's a federally backed loan there and you're in your structures in a high risk flood zone, they're required to tell you you need flood insurance. And if you don't get it, they will force place coverage on you, which can be higher than what's available if you just go to your agent. Now, private lenders, can they look at our flood maps and make a requirement for flood insurance? Absolutely.
I'm sorry, can we just, so I think we're gonna start saying each other. I'm not talking about that. So you alluded to that. So I've been told that FEMA offers like an insurance, but then it was brought up that there's private insurers. And I
Yes.
was wondering if the federally backed mortgage lenders recognize private flood insurers. I'm not talking about privately backed loans.
Got it. Okay. Yes, they absolutely do. They can still say to you, we only want you to have an NFIP policy, but I haven't seen anybody do that in like 5 years. I haven't had a single call about it, but most lenders will allow private flood insurance. You just need to call them in advance before you buy the private flood insurance. You just want to double check with your lender and say, hey, if I buy through this private flood insurance, is that going to be acceptable to you? And I would want to get that in writing, just so they can't come back and change their mind later. But I don't see too many change their mind, but I always think it's good to get stuff in writing from your lender. Or an email, something.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Definitely appreciate that. All right, before we close up shop, I wanted to launch one more poll. And this is the feedback poll. Would love to hear what you think, if this meeting answered all your questions, if it answered some of the questions and you'd like to follow up, or did not answer any of the questions. And again, if we didn't answer any of the questions, we are happy to help answer those, and you can contact the folks that you see on the screen. And I will leave this open. And if there are no other questions, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Thank you so much for answering the poll and asking the questions, and for attending tonight. We really appreciate your participation and appreciate your commitment to understanding flood risk and being part of the community. So with that, I will do the official thank you and ending the call. And I hope everyone has a great evening, and hope that everyone stays safe.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions and your participation this evening.
Yep. And this is Erin. For those of you who participated tonight, please talk to your neighbors, for the ones that didn't make it on the call, and pass along what you learned.